It's very heartening to have been asked back again, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I take that as a measure of the interest that this topic creates. Now, it's never a good idea to start a talk with an apology, but I really do want to convey apology from Professor David Galloway. David is a surgeon, and he has recently spent 6 weeks in Africa. And when he got back, he had a number of things that he had to tend to, including some family issues, and he just wasn't able to be with us tonight. So on his behalf, I send that apology. But David hopes to be at the next event in the series, and since I'll have to do it all tonight, then I will invite him to do the bulk of it next time when we're together. Now, the title of the lecture is Darwin or Design, and I recognise immediately that that is a pretty provocative title, and in some ways it's a somewhat oversimplified title, but it does highlight what I would consider to be a major issue in our time. Darwin has become code for a story of origins that is about blind, purposeless forces that arrived at us without having us in mind. Now, of course, that goes quite a way beyond what Darwin himself had to say, but Darwin is code for that, really. Darwin is code for science has sorted all the problems about this, and there's not much more to say about it. However, there is also the question of where did anything come from, and why is it the way it is, and might we not be able to detect in the natural world the evidence of design? So that, if you like, is a kind of simplified code for what is a major debate about who we are and where we came from. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My interest since I was at school is an interest in chemistry. I had a great chemistry teacher, and I became so interested in chemistry that I did it at university. I stayed on and did research in chemistry, got a PhD in chemistry, and then decided that I wanted to teach chemistry in secondary education, and most of my career has been around schools and science education. Now, I don't want anything I say tonight to be taken to mean that I don't think science has done a great deal for us. Of course it has. And what I liked about chemistry when I did it was that it was just so logical. It was just so beautiful. It was just so rational. And science basically is the application of our rational thinking to the world in which we live. So I am not in any sense anti-science. My career has been built around science, and I think science is one of the great factors that has made the world the way it is and has given to so many of us many great benefits. So scientists understandably have huge credibility. But I've also always been interested in ultimate questions, and particularly interested in what we can detect about the answers to ultimate questions. So, where did anything come from? And why are things the way they are legitimate areas of inquiry about which science has a great deal to say. And so it was really that kind of thinking that got me interested about a decade ago in what has become known as intelligent design. Now, this is a toxic brand, and I've discovered, I thought that this would be quite a legitimate debate, that people would really be interested in debating whether there is real design in the universe and that there is evidence of it that could be described as scientific. But alas, no, I find that this is a really toxic argument. People say all kinds of outrageous things about people who indicate that they're sympathetic towards intelligent design, and so I've become like a climate change denier. I'm an evolution denier, apparently. And the bitterness of the debate tells me that there's something significant about this. Early on in our journey with the Centre for Intelligent Design, we met a leading journalist. And I won't tell you the name, but it's a name you would probably know. And this journalist said to us, "I'm intrigued by what you're doing because when I see the level of controversy that you guys stimulate, I say to myself, you must be onto something." So I'm very pleased to have the chance to talk to you about intelligent design. Those of you who were at my previous talk here will probably recognize quite a bit of it. I'm not going to apologize for that, because I do think this is a subject that needs to be revisited. And in 40 minutes or so, I'm not going to be able to say all I want to say tonight, but we'll do some of it. And then next time, when Professor Galloway is here with me, we'll do some of the rest of it. I've given you a handout, and had I known there'd be so many, I would have prepared more. But I've given a single handout with just the major points that I would like to make in my talk tonight, though I won't make all of them. And that's just a summary of the kind of areas that we're going to visit. But please sit back and think about this, and then when I get to the end of my talk, we can have a time of discussion. So there's the definition of intelligent design. Intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. But it highlights a very important feature of design, and that is that you and I instinctively recognize design without thinking about it. In fact, it is very difficult to pick up something in this room, say, which is not designed. Just about everything in the room is designed. And we don't pick up a book and say, is this designed, or a chair? We don't pick it up and wonder if it's designed. We just kind of instinctively know that it is. And it's interesting to think about why we know that. And there are basically two reasons how we know that things are designed. If something has a very low probability of being brought about by some known process, some natural process, or by any kind of chance process that you can imagine, that would be one of the features of design. So if I said to you, you know, this chair, no, it's not a chair, it's actually a coffee table. I think you would get it from IKEA. I'm not sure if you'd want it, but you could certainly get it from IKEA. If I said to you that this had been produced accidentally by an explosion in a wood yard, you would probably get up and go away and have a cup of coffee and think that guy's off his head. So we know that something like that is not going to occur by any kind of random or natural process that we're aware of. So low probability and high specification, because that's the other thing. We know, without even thinking about it, that to get an object like that, somebody had to think about it. Somebody had to make a drawing of it. Somebody had to translate that drawing into some kind of process that a workman could turn into that particular object. So these are the two simple characteristics of design. Something that has low probability and a high degree of specification is almost certainly designed. Now, we don't give that a second thought. I sometimes ask pupils when I'm talking to them about this to give me an example of something that's not designed. And I've had two good answers about that. One is, some of them say the object's in a waste paper basket. Well, that's pretty good. The way in which the objects lie in the basket is pretty random. The objects themselves are almost certainly designed, of course they are, but the way it's thrown into the basket is random. So yeah, that's a pretty good example. And I think the best one I got was when somebody said to me, the ashes from a fire. You know, the pile of ashes that you get from a fire are not designed, and that's true. It's a kind of random collection of ash that has dropped from the fire onto the ash pan. Though I would have to say, if you could look down into the molecular and atomic structure of ash, you would find dazzling design. But yeah, that's a good example. But just think about that. We don't stop to ask ourselves, are things designed or not? We just kind of know by looking at them. And the question is, how is it that to apply that same logic or thought to life and the universe is such a controversial matter? Just as a starting point, that strikes me as being fairly interesting. I don't know if any of you are devotees of the West Wing. I bought a box of the West Wing a number of months ago, or years ago, and I got to about season 3, and I'd had enough. It was really interesting, but I had enough. And then I discovered recently that I had not even opened Series 6 and Series 7. So I had a look at Series 7. This is when President Bartlett eventually steps down and a new president takes over. And so the new president, who was actually Congressman Santos, on the campaign trail was asked in a meeting, did he support intelligent design? You know, I was kind of dozing when I was watching this, and I nearly fell off my seat. I thought, here we go. And here's West Wing in one of its episodes in Series 7 talking about West Wing. And the candidate said, well, I believe in God, and I'd expect him to be intelligent. And of course, all his aides went into a flap about this because they said, oh, that's the wrong answer. You don't want to give any suggestion that you're opposed to the separation of church and state, and you don't want to give people the idea that intelligent design is science. And so eventually he made another statement to say that he didn't think intelligent design was science, and corrected the thing, and it blew over. Now, I was intrigued as to why would you get that in a mainstream series, television series like West Wing? Well, here's my guess. I think they were doing that series of West Wing around the time of what has become known as the Dover trial in Pennsylvania in 2004. What happened in that trial was that there was a school board in Pennsylvania who wanted the pupils who were being taught evolution in the biology class to be aware that there was another point of view in this. And if they were interested in another point of view, including intelligent design, there were books in the library that they could consult. Now, nobody was advocating teaching intelligent design. They were just saying that pupils should be aware that there is another point of view about this. You would have thought that that would have been a fairly modest kind of thing to say. In fact, you might even say that that would be a very desirable educational thing to do. But of course, this caused a furore. The American Civil Liberties Union took the school board to court, and they did actually win their case. And the very interesting thing is that in summing up the case, Judge Jones, who actually became a national celebrity for ruling that intelligent design was not science, although you would almost certainly want to question the basis of that judgment. But among the many things he said, this is what he said: while intelligent design or ID arguments may be true, a proposition on which the court takes no position, ID is not science. Now, I think there's an astonishing kind of admission in that. ID may be true, but it is not science. And you see immediately that there's a kind of demarcation line here as to what can be considered science, and it doesn't matter if the thing you exclude is true or not. You see, when I was a student of science, I thought that science was about trying to find out what is true. Now, I'm not suggesting that science can answer all the questions, but this does raise an issue about, is it science or not? And the question might be, well, does it matter whether it's science or not? The more fundamental question might be, is it true or not? That seems to me to be the issue. And if it's true, and if the basis on which that claim is made relates to what we would normally regard as scientific judgments, then what's the problem? I thought in science we were in the business of trying to find out what was true. And in the area of origins, which is where a lot of this debate happens, then surely you would have to countenance the possibility, when considering the origin of things, that there could be an intelligent cause beyond the natural processes. Because in any case, the natural processes require some kind of explanation as to where they came from. So I think that would be something of the connection between the West Wing and Judge Jones. The West Wing, of course, is fictitious, but Judge Jones is deeply serious, as you can probably understand. Now, this is not so surprising because in a book by Philip Johnson, who is regarded by some people as the father of the intelligent design movement, at least the modern version of it, Philip Johnson was a very significant lawyer in the United States and ultimately a professor of law at the University of Berkeley in California, and he's written this book about the right questions. But in his book, he quotes an American scientist, Scott Todd. And Scott Todd, in Nature in 1999, made this astonishing statement: even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Now, that's a very candid, a very candid statement, but a very peculiar statement. Because if there is an intelligent designer, and if the data points to that, why would that be ruled out as part of scientific debate about origins? I mean, I would have thought scientists would want to know about that, rather than ruling it out and saying, well, it's not naturalistic, so we can't have it. Now, you get the same kind of thing from Steven Weinberg, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, I think, and in his recent book, To Explain the World, he says, though science has nothing to say one way or the other about the existence of God or an afterlife, its goal is to find explanations of natural phenomena that are purely naturalistic. Now, in substantial measure, that is what scientists do. I mean, when I was doing bench chemistry at the University of Glasgow and trying to understand certain processes and certain phenomena and the structure of certain substances, yes, that's what we did. We thought about what natural processes are involved to explain these structures. And that is what, indeed, a lot of operational science is built on that particular proposition. But the trouble is, when you come to think about the origin of things, you can't rule out the possibility that the naturalistic itself requires an explanation. And to rule it out and say only naturalistic explanations can be considered in science is really to give you about at least a 50% chance of getting it wrong when it comes to origins. So why would you limit yourself in that way and say we cannot consider anything beyond processes that are naturalistic? But that's kind of where we are. And so, one other quote from Eugenie Scott. Eugenie Scott was the director of the, I've just forgotten the exact body she was director of, but it had to do with science education in America. And she makes this statement: science neither denies or opposes the supernatural, but ignores the supernatural for methodological reasons. Now, I understand how that starts. You know, scientists are about natural processes, but to ignore the supernatural or the possibility of it is really to tie one of your hands behind your back when you come to consider the matter of origins. And so I suggest to you that the fundamental question about this is, in looking at the origins of things and how things came to be, do we follow the evidence where it leads? Or do we accept in advance the assertions of the scientific elite who say, well, we can't have anything that's not naturalistic, so therefore intelligent design by definition is wrong? It's certainly not science, maybe true, but it's not science. Why would you do that? Why would you tie yourself in a knot before you start looking at the evidence and deciding what might be the source of all the marvel and beauty and wonder that we see in the world around us? Now, you may think this is a bit of an academic discussion and that it doesn't matter all that much, but let me tell you about the case of Professor Michael Rice. I have met Michael Rice. He is, I would describe him as the quintessential English gentleman. He is a biologist by training. He is professor of education at the London Institute of Education, and he also happens to be an Anglican vicar. So that's quite a lot to be going on with for one individual. Very thoughtful individual, and at a conference, I think it might have been the Association of Science Education, but you can find it online. In 2008, Michael Rice said that science lessons should be willing to tackle creationism and intelligent design. Now, creationism is not the same thing as intelligent design. Creationism is really a position that's derived from religious authority and indeed from biblical authority. Intelligent design is an argument that comes out of the data and out of science, but those who oppose intelligent design are not prepared to allow that distinction. They kind of wrap it together so that intelligent design can be pushed off the table as some kind of religious position. Well, what Michael Rice said was that if students raise these questions in a biology class or a science class, then teachers should be willing to discuss with them what they have heard about creationism or intelligent design, and they should be willing to discuss that within the context of science. The really interesting thing about this is that Michael Rice himself is not a proponent of intelligent design. In fact, I think he says he's a convinced Darwinist. But he did say, I think we should allow discussion of these matters. And the Royal Society, of which he was the Director of Education, an honorary position, was so enraged by this that Michael Rice was forced to resign. He had to step down from his post because some of his colleagues claimed that he was bringing the Royal Society into disrepute. This was an incredible decision. I mean, Michael Rice wasn't saying, we teach these things, we should be prepared to discuss them if they are raised. The Royal Society actually was established back in the time of Sir Isaac Newton, and it was set up as the society to explore the world of nature and, can you believe, the world of Holy Scripture. It's got rather a long way away from that by the 20th century. Even Richard Dawkins said that he thought this decision about Michael Rice made him feel squeamish. And so it should. So, for some reason, this is a highly toxic debate. And particularly in the scientific community, you will do yourself career damage. You will certainly do yourself reputational damage if you put your head above the parapet and say, I think intelligent design is an argument worth exploring. And if any of you are interested, I've brought some DVDs with me on the subject, which explores in the 90-minute DVD the progress of intelligent design in the United States and the damage it has done to academics who have said there's a point here that needs to be discussed. We'll talk about this a little later. Now, just to take this a little bit further, over the summer I read David Glass's book. David Glass is a lecturer in computing at the University of Ulster, and he's also something of a philosopher, having studied philosophy as well as computing, and he's written a book entitled Atheism's New Clothes. It's quite a challenging read, but it's a very good read, a very thorough investigation of the position of the new atheists. But he quotes Richard Dawkins from the God Delusion, and here is what Richard Dawkins says. Richard Dawkins says, there has probably never been a more devastating rout of popular belief by clever reasoning than Charles Darwin's destruction of the argument from design. And that's how I come up with the title Darwin or Design. Because although this oversimplifies the matter considerably, this is a popular view that Darwin's theory has completely destroyed the argument from design. And in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins says, Darwinism makes atheism intellectually satisfying. One of the things that those of us that talk about intelligent design find is that we are immediately accused of being fundamentalist Christians or motivated by religious ideas. It's very interesting that Professor Dawkins has no hesitation in saying that Darwinism leads to atheism and is quite open about that, whereas you might say that intelligent design would lead in the other direction. But the important point about it is that Richard Dawkins' atheism is, as he sees it, an implication of Darwinism. Just as with intelligent design, the belief that there is a mind behind the universe, or indeed that God exists, is not the essence of intelligent design, but is the clear implication of it. So what is sauce for the goose is also sauce for the gander. If Professor Dawkins wishes to draw from his Darwinism the implication of atheism, then I think those of us who are interested in intelligent design might be allowed to say that intelligent design makes you an intellectually fulfilled theist. I mean, I think that's fair, and I think that's reasonable. Though not all people who recognize intelligent design are automatically theists, and that's a rather interesting point. But is Professor Dawkins' claim true? Is that what Darwin did? Now, I show you this slide with a little tongue-in-cheek and ask, was Darwin a creationist? But here's a very interesting thing that Darwin said in The Origin of Species. Certainly in the second edition, he says, there is a grandeur in this view of life, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. Now that statement of Darwin is pretty controversial because some people say, well, he didn't really believe that. He put that in to keep his wife happy. She was a devout Anglican. Or he put it in so that his theory wouldn't be totally rejected by the Anglican establishment. Well, I wouldn't know about all that, and certainly the little I do know in this particular area is that I do think that Darwin lost a lot of his faith when he was a student, and certainly the sudden death of his young 10-year-old daughter didn't help him to embrace the faith that his wife so assiduously followed. But he does say it. And there is in Darwin's work the suggestion that he was never entirely sure that he could dismiss the creator, though those who came after him, there's a film about this, and there's a quite dramatic scene in it where it may be Huxley, I've just forgotten, but it may be when he heard of Darwin's theory, one of his colleagues, when he heard of Darwin's theory, said, "Sir, you've just killed God." Well, actually, it looks as though Darwin wasn't entirely sure about that. And so I think the claim that Darwin's work completely demolished the argument from design is a bit premature. And that's part of what we'll go on to look at a little later. Now, one of the things you're not really allowed to do these days is to be critical of the theory of evolution. In fact, we're getting to the stage now where the guidance that is given in schools to teachers from government, certainly in England, and there was a recent petition in the Scottish Parliament to get the same kind of thing, is to effectively rule out discussion of intelligent design within science, and that intelligent design is not to be regarded in any sense as a scientific theory or a theory that's compatible with science. It's a very odd thing that discussion of a major scientific theory like Darwinism is to be shut down. I mean, that's not what science is about. I mean, any scientific theory should always be open to question and always be open to skepticism. And I do sometimes wonder if, when you get to the stage that you need the protection of law and government guidance about a theory, you're not as sure about it as you sound you are. This is a very odd thing indeed, and something which, with my relatively modest scientific background, I'm appalled at. Why is it not appropriate to ask questions of Darwinism and to subject it to the kind of rigorous debate that any scientific theory would normally get? And it's not as if there aren't questions about Darwinism that need answering. I won't go into this in detail because this is fairly complicated, but just look at the list. Darwin's theory, or neo-Darwinism as it now is, does not really have a coherent theory of how we get sophisticated biomolecules, the substance of life. Oh yeah, plenty of theories about it, but no convincing explanation as to how you assemble the complex molecules of life. No view of the origin of life itself. Most people say, well, Darwinism is not about the origin of life, it's about how life develops. Well, okay, but this is like building a skyscraper with no foundation. You would expect that there would at least be some understanding of how life began in the first place if it's all naturalistic. There is increasing unease about whether random mutation and natural selection are sufficient to generate molecular machines and new life forms. And there's a degree of skepticism creeping into the scientific literature about whether mutation and natural selection is enough. Those of you who know anything at all about this will know that in the last few years, the whole junk DNA idea is being abandoned. This is the idea that only 2% of our DNA is biologically active, and that 98% of it is probably the debris from evolution that we've collected over billions of years. The ENCODE project in Cambridge over the last number of years has indicated that up to 80% of our DNA is chemically and therefore probably biologically active. And although the textbooks will carry junk DNA for a good few decades, the position is that junk DNA is beginning to look pretty unlikely. Some people raise doubts about aspects of the tree of life, how everything is related to the original first cell. And the fossil record, which is almost always put forward as the evidence for Darwinism, has major problems about it. Indeed, Darwin himself was perplexed by the absence of the thousands of transitional forms that should be in the fossil record if slight successive changes is how we got from goo to zoo to you, that kind of sequence. There would have to be millions of transitional forms, and he was perplexed that they weren't there. He thought that in time they would be filled in, but the reality is they haven't really been filled in. And there's a question about that. The origin of genetic information, which I'll come to in a moment, is something that Darwinism doesn't have a convincing explanation for. And then you come to the whole matter of mind and consciousness. And those of you who are not already sleeping will know that what you're doing at this moment is using your mind and your consciousness to think about what I'm saying, agreeing with it, doubting it, or getting angry about it. But we're conscious beings, we've got minds, we think. So what's the explanation of that? And the best that you can come up with is that somehow this is an accidental byproduct of physics and chemistry. It doesn't feel like it. But that would have to be the kind of neo-Darwinian explanation. Now, what I'm saying is that there are questions to be asked about Darwinism. It's very difficult to ask them. And by all means, let's reflect on Darwin's theory. By all means, let's hear it. By all means, let's hear the propositions behind it. But let's also be honest about the limitations of it. And let's also be honest to look at what are possible alternative explanations for much of this. Now, I came across this book, came out in 2011, I think, 2010 or 11, by Thomas Nagel. Now, Thomas Nagel is a world-class philosopher, teaches in one of the universities in New York, and his book is entitled Mind and Cosmos. This is about consciousness and mind. It's the subtitle that's catching. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. Wow. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. And his argument is largely based on the argument that if a theory of origins cannot begin to explain mind and consciousness, then it's not really explaining anything, because mind and consciousness is the most obvious characteristic of our life and our existence. Thomas Nagel got the treatment, of course. Some people claimed he was a danger to his students and all of this. But you know, the really incredible thing about Thomas Nagel is an atheist. And he still thinks that the neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. So at the very least, that indicates that there are certainly questions to be answered about this. So, okay. We could go on forever about the details of Darwinism and so on, the strengths and the possible weaknesses, the weaknesses in it. But, you know, there are huge questions here. Where did the universe come from? Where does natural law come from? Where does life come from? Where does genetic information come from? Where does mind and consciousness come from? And these are questions that go deeper even than Darwinism, and questions that actually don't go away, and questions about which you would think it would be legitimate to look at scientific data and ask the questions. Well, here's the kind of thing that happens. You may have noticed that Stephen Hawking and some of his colleagues have recently got £75 million to look at the nearest 1 million stars to the Earth in order to see if they can find signs of life on these planets. And I was reading about this in the Telegraph recently, and this is what he said at the launch of it. And Stephen Hawking is a very bright man and a very brave man. This is what he said: "We believe that life arose spontaneously on Earth. So in an infinite universe, there must be other occurrences of life." So nobody disputes that, until you look at it carefully and you realize that what he is actually doing is making an assumption and then adding an assertion to it. He is assuming that life arose spontaneously on Earth, and since that is the case, then he can assert that there is almost certainly life elsewhere in the universe. Now, this is not actually science. This is actually philosophy, because the proposition that life arose spontaneously on Earth has not been demonstrated. Indeed, the evidence would rather suggest it doesn't arise spontaneously on Earth. And this is what bedevils this debate. You assume, first of all, the thing that you're trying to prove, and then from that, you go on to assert what the consequences of it are. Now, I don't want to sound arrogant in any way, but I read recently from Lord Rees, the Astronomer Royal, and you don't get more impressive credentials than that. He was writing in the Telegraph in January of this year, and you'll see what he says. We know how simple life evolved into our present biosphere, but we don't know how the first life was generated from a soup of chemicals. And then this incredible statement: it might have involved a fluke so rare that it happened only once in the entire galaxy. Now, I think you would not be inclined to take Lord Rees to task over his scientific views on origins, but the choice seems to be here between the fluke theory or the design theory. And I would have thought that the design theory is at least as good as the fluke theory, and arguably very much better. So you see the nature of this debate. The nature of this debate is that certain kind of explanations are ruled out by definition, and therefore we come down to the sort of possibilities of there being a fluke. And he says that the origin of life might have been almost inevitable given the right environment, but I'm not at all sure what that means. I think that's just another way of saying a fluke. So we are really up against this kind of random fluke that made it all possible, or deliberate design. You're going to have to give me 5 more minutes, okay? So just back to the definition of intelligent design, holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. And so I think the question is there evidence of design in nature? And I'm not going to do these 7 areas tonight, but we'll do some of them next time. I suggest there are around 7 areas in which design is the best explanation of the data. But even if you remain skeptical of those arguments, you still have the problem. If you're thinking about blind and purposeless processes and natural laws, you still have the problem of explaining where they came from. So this is not something that can be easily dismissed. And certainly you can't even if you're a scientist, especially if you're a scientist, you can't rule out before you start the possibility that we're looking at design. Now, I thought I might not get as far as this, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to back up, as the Americans say. No, I'm not. I'm going to go forward. 10 minutes. Okay. I'm going to start at the end. And I'm going to start with DNA. Now, you've probably heard me say this before, but it's worth saying this again. DNA is the most incredible substance in the world. DNA is the stuff that carries the code of life. So we talk about the genetic code. And this is a picture of the DNA molecule. I remember when I was a student at Glasgow University hearing Jim Watson came to speak at Glasgow University on how they worked out the structure of the DNA molecule. I remember the lecture theatre packed to absolute capacity as this celebrity scientist described the way in which they worked out the structure of this molecule. I think in the west of Scotland we might be inclined to say, forgive me if I'm libeling the dear man, that Jim Watson was a bit of a chancer. You know, he didn't actually do a lot of work himself, but he had this brilliant streak that he could read other people's work and he could see what other people didn't see. And Crick and Watson, I think I'm right in saying that Crick actually worked at Bletchley Park during the war as a code breaker. So this was an appropriate area for him to be working in. And Crick and Watson together, when looking at the crystallography photographs of other scientists, were able to detect the pattern that was consistent with a double helix, and they came up with eventually with the structure of DNA. And there it is in all its beauty. It's a double helical molecule, and it carries the genetic code. And the letters that run down the center of DNA, the A, T, C, G, are not actually letters. They're chemical units: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. And it is the sequencing of these chemical units that carry the information that build human beings, and indeed all living things. Let me ask you to engage for a moment in a thought exercise. We all began life as a single cell. In our mother's womb, a single cell is where it started. I mean, how amazing is that? A cell is too small to see with the naked eye, but if you get a microscope, you'll see them. And a single cell, a fertilized egg, a fertilized ovum, contains about 6 feet of DNA. If you took the 2 strands of DNA, unwound them, joined them together, you get about 6 feet of DNA. And in that 6 feet of DNA is carried the genetic code that built you and built me. The sequence of the base pairs code for amino acids. The amino acids join up into proteins. The proteins are built up into the various structures of the body and so on. I'm oversimplifying, of course I am. But fundamentally, that's how it works. And DNA carries the code for human beings and for living things. You see, the base pairs are not arranged regularly. They're not arranged randomly. They are arranged in digital code, is what we would call it, digital code. You are looking at a form of biological software that carries the information that builds human beings. I was looking the other night at a scan of a pregnant mum who had just got a scan, and I was looking at the fetus 12 weeks on, and I could see the outline of the head and the body and the legs, and 6 centimeters. And this is developing and building a human being. That's how each of us come into the world. We have roughly 100 trillion cells in our bodies, 50 to 100 trillion cells in our bodies. It depends what size you are. Now, a trillion is a very big number, as you know. A trillion is roughly the British national debt, so that gives you some kind of idea of how big it is. If you were to take all the DNA in your body and join it all together, it would give you a chain of DNA that reaches to the moon and back. And if you take my little booklet, it says 8,000 times. I'm actually wrong about that. Somebody pointed it out to me, so if there's ever another edition, we'll correct it. It's not 8,000 times, it's 200,000 times. Now, I hope you feel like saying, like the leaflet for the kitchen, wow. Yeah, indeed, wow. And every cell in our body carries a complete set of DNA, a complete set of the information. And the body knows how to switch it on and switch it off and how to use it to build this and build that and change this and so on. No wonder Bill Gates said that DNA is more sophisticated than all his computer programs. Now you think about that for a moment. How did Bill Gates get his computer programs? Well, I'll tell you how he didn't get them. He didn't get them by opening the windows of his laboratories and letting the weather blow through. He got it by employing software engineers who used their mind to create the code that is translated into software and that becomes the means of carrying information. Now, for me, this was the argument that drew me into intelligent design. There are 6 others, but this is the one that did it for me. Because you see, information is itself an immaterial thing, but it is encoded onto some substrate or some substance. So I'm using a PC, and the hard disk of the PC carries the software in ones and zeros in binary code that conveys the information that you're looking at on the screen. Now, we know from all our experience, we know that information, functional information, does not randomly assemble itself. The information that we have become used to, and hey, we live in an information age. We're probably all suffering from information overload. You're probably sitting there thinking, I wish this guy would stop so that I could get back to my emails. I saw a woman walking across the road today. I see it every other day, reading her phone as she's walking across the road. You know, it's incredible how we've got absorbed in this. But we really don't think about the marvel of this. The information is this immaterial phenomenon which is based on the sequencing of ones and zeros, and that conveys what's in somebody else's mind to you through this medium. Now, if you're a scientist, and I think this is legitimate, and if you look at DNA, and you say to yourself, that's an incredibly beautiful chemical molecule. It is. It's probably the most beautiful of them. But then you say, what is the origin of the genetic information? Where did it come from? And I suppose the standard answer would be, well, we don't really know, but it would have to have come about in some kind of naturalistic process. Indeed, some kind of chance process. Well, I would beg to differ about that, because I think that when you look at the information content of DNA, if you are using the scientific method of inference to the best explanation, then I think it would be legitimate to say that that appears to be the product of something akin to our own mind. This is not binary code. This is quaternary code that codes for human beings. And so I put it to you that the existence of biological information in all of life is a compelling argument for proposing that what you are looking at is the product of mind. And that's consistent with the other 6 things that I'll talk about, or David will talk about another time. But this is what drew me into the intelligent design argument. The other things are the fine-tuning of our universe, the enormous complexity of biological systems that appear to be irreducibly complex, and of course our own intuition, which says you don't get this level of complexity just by chance, and just by random processes, and just by the operation of natural law. But let me finish with this one thing. I said to you at the beginning that intelligent design is a very toxic kind of brand. In fact, you are considered really in the same category as an idiot if you contemplate it. But you know, here's the astonishing thing. The pioneers of Western science. Now, I know that in the Middle Ages, the Islamic Empire made significant progress in science. And the progress that was made in science then was carried forward in the 15th, 16th, 17th century by the pioneers of Western science. Do you know the astonishing thing about that is that almost all of these individuals, like Newton and Kepler and Galileo, they were all people that were convinced they were exploring a universe that had been intelligently designed. The idea that science is about rejecting design would be utterly foreign to the pioneers of modern science. Indeed, they believed that science was only possible because the universe is rational, and we can rationally perceive it. And every one of them, almost to a man, there weren't many women among them at that time, almost to a man, were theists. They believed essentially in a universe that was able to be understood and that showed all the evidence of intelligent design. So the idea that intelligent design is just something that cropped up in America in the last 10, 20 years is absolutely ridiculous. It is the idea that gave us science in the first place. And I don't see why we should not be at liberty, at least, to discuss it, along with the propositions that other scientists put about the origin of the universe. Well, thank you very much for listening, and we'll leave it there. I'm being asked, are there any other areas of science where minority views are treated with disdain? I think there's a very obvious one, which is climate change. Now, I'm not an expert in climate change, but if you raise a voice against the science of global warming as being the result of human activity, you will be branded a climate change denier, and you will almost certainly be limited in your appearances on radio and television, and maybe even banned. Now, I frankly don't know the arguments about global warming and not, but what I do know is that there's a small number of credible scientists who are not convinced that the climate change argument is sound in the form that it's being promulgated and in the consequences. And that's an area where instead of saying, let's look at this, let's examine this evidence, let's go through it, they might claim they have, but the persistent voices about it are squashed. And you know some of the East Anglia stuff that's going on about emails and so on. That's an area. And actually, it's a worrying trend in science that dissent from the majority view is increasingly pilloried, and that's not the nature of science. Okay, somebody's asking about whether there can be a coalescing of some elements of evolutionary theory and intelligent design. Well, the answer to that is yes, there can. And indeed, within the intelligent design community, there are scientists who would accept a significant proportion of Darwinian theory, but they would insist that you could only ever get the evolution of life if there is an intelligent design behind it. They would dispute that you can get that by random mutation and natural selection. And indeed, there's a small but growing body of evidence that would indicate that random mutations are not sufficient to create new life forms. So yes, there can be a marrying of these two things, but the fact of the matter is that there are significant objections to evolutionary theory as it's commonly taught. And I think a majority of people in this intelligent design community would be pretty skeptical about the big picture. Now, the difficulty with evolution is that it's a very slippery word. It depends what you mean. Evolution has about 8 different meanings, but the 2 major meanings are, do living things adapt to their environment? No question, that's what they do. That's adaptation. Mutations and changes enable certain forms of species to persist and others to die out. No question that happens. But the extrapolation from that, which is that you can go from the simplest organism all the way up to the most complex organism by random mutations, is an idea that is loosely based on evidence. And that idea is a hypothesis. It's not a fact, as everybody says. And I think most of the people in the intelligent design community would say, if you leave out the element of design at the beginning, then you've really got to be skeptical about all the rest of it. Asking a question about how it is that, given that there are scriptures and holy books that talk about this, how is it that people don't accept it now? I think that's the gist of your question. Well, that's quite a complicated question. Let's for a moment make the assumption that there is an intelligent designer, there is a mind behind the universe, and I think actually that's an inescapable conclusion, not just from science, but from philosophy, from rational thought. There has to be a sufficient cause for the universe, which is itself not caused by anything else. I know that's a great mystery, but philosophically, I don't think you can escape from that. Now, if there is an intelligent designer, and most people would recognize that as God, if God exists, it would be very surprising if he didn't make himself known in other ways. Now, the argument of intelligent design is there is clear evidence within what we broadly call science of the existence of an intelligent mind and most people would say a creator. But it would be very surprising if that were the case, that there weren't other sources of information about that. And I'm a Christian, and so within Christian thought, people would sense that God has revealed himself in other ways, and that would include Holy Scripture. If you're a Muslim, I guess you think that you believe the same thing. So I don't think it's surprising that if that intelligent designer exists, there would be other sources of getting to know him. But then that's going beyond what I've been talking about, and that, I think, takes us into the area where if you begin to sense that you live in a universe where there's a designer, and I think that's inescapable, then the next thing I think is you would want to know something about him, and that would take you into the kind of search that you've been talking about. And that's without committing yourself to any particular interpretation. I hope that's kind of satisfies your question. You're asking how many scientists have thought that Darwin's theory was wrong. Well, I guess I couldn't put a number on that for you. And in fact, I think, if you don't mind me saying so, I think that's a slightly oversimplistic statement of the position, because what Darwin observed, when he observed the variation in finches and the ability of finches, birds, to adapt to a different environment, is kind of self-evident. So there's a lot of the stuff that Darwin did that is beyond dispute. Living things are able to exist in a range of environments because of the variation within them and because of natural selection. Nobody's disputing that. And Darwin was a very careful analyst and thinker about that. But the Darwinian theory has gone well beyond that to give us a comprehensive explanation of how you go from the simplest form of life to every other form of life. And I think what you will find, and it's not a huge number of people. At the moment, it's a relatively small number of people, but you find creeping into the scientific literature questions about Darwinism, beginning to say, that doesn't look like that would be credible, and so there's a growing number. If I were to give you a list, and I can't give you off the top of my head, I think I could find you 20 or 30 people who are publishing in the literature, not necessarily committing themselves to intelligent design, but saying we need something better than we've got. And by the way, I just heard on the radio this week, I always thought the Big Bang started off like a huge explosion of light. Well, somebody was on the radio last week saying that actually it wasn't so much a bang, it was more of a whimper. Gases started to get together. And there was another program 2 weeks ago which talked about the cosmic dark ages, that the universe was dark for millions of years, and then it suddenly lit up. And what that taught me was that, it's very easy to say the Big Bang is absolutely established. Well, there's some scientists who say, well, actually, yeah, there was a point of beginning, but it wasn't a bang, and it wasn't light. And so I think what we need in the area of Darwinism is an open mind to say, is that really credible? Is it really credible that random mutations are going to take us up the line of species into the kind of complex organisms that we are? And there are scientists that are beginning to publish doubts about that, and some that would claim to demonstrate quite clearly that random mutation and natural selection doesn't work. So I hope it's not a huge number, but it's a growing doubt about Darwin. You're asking the question about vested interests in science. That's a very good question. And actually, there was an edition of The Economist, I think about a year ago, which had the stark title, How Science Gets It Wrong. And it was arguing that a lot of research in science can't be repeated. And it was particularly around the area of pharmaceuticals and so on, that when people tried to repeat scientific work, they couldn't actually repeat it. And they were suggesting that when you get huge budgets to do research, you've got to come up with some kind of result. And the temptation, you can see what the temptation is. And then people go back and try and do it, and they can't repeat it. Now, that's in the nature of science. But yeah, I accept that. But I'd make this comment to you. Why do we think that scientists would be any different from any other group of people? If Volkswagen are going to fit deceptive software in their engines, it's not just motor engineers that do that. Why would scientists be absolutely pure as the driven snow and not susceptible to that kind of thing? However, I don't want you to disillusion me, because I'm actually a great believer in the scientific method. And I think science is a very elegant method of doing things. But yeah, I think there is bias in science, as there is in every other area of life. And there certainly is bias against the argument for design, even though I would argue that the evidence of design is overwhelming, at least to me. It's certainly credible. So yeah, you're right. We're all subject to biases of one kind or another. And we need to try and be as honest as we can about the things that we see. Well, what is the end point of Darwinism? That also is quite a hard question. And there's a whole range of views about that. For example, Richard Dawkins and his colleagues, I think, would argue that the end point of Darwinism is atheism. And I think a great many people would argue that Darwinism would lead them away from any kind of faith. Like, for example, there was a survey of Christianity done in Scotland by the Barna organisation just in the last few months. And they put a number of points to people. They surveyed, I think it was 1,000 people, and they asked them, which of these statements do you think are true about Christianity? And the one that came out at the top was, Christianity is not compatible with science. So the end point for a great many people is that science disproves Christian faith. And I would guess in the Islamic world you find exactly the same thing. It's an astonishing fact that in Britain, a survey of religion indicated that 18 to 25-year-olds, 46% of them now don't believe in any kind of God. And if you press that a little further, a lot of it comes down to believing that the scientists have explained the origin of life, the origin of the universe, and therefore there's no need for faith and no need for God. So I personally think that that kind of Darwinism is very destructive of faith. And that's an issue. But I actually think it's wrong too. I mean, I think it's just plain wrong, because the evidence is, whether you look at the origin of the universe or the complexity of life, there is clear evidence of design, and therefore that leads you in another direction. Now, why that is, I don't know. I'm as perplexed about this as many other people. Why would you not want to respond to the clear evidence of design? I think it's because some people equate that with a very narrow-minded kind of religion that restricts them and binds them and so on. That would be my experience as a Christian. And of course, that's not what we're about. We're about saying this is a reality that needs to be faced up to. But of course, the minute you open your mind to the possibility of design, then the next question is, who is the designer? And to what extent am I responsible? And therefore, that's critical. So I think Darwinism is, on the whole, destructive of that kind of view of life. Although, in fairness, there are people that would hold to the Darwinian view of life and say that's the way God did it. And that becomes a theological position. But I think before you get to making theological pronouncements about Darwin, you really need to be sure that the science of Darwinism is firm. Because I wouldn't want to build a theological position on a science that I think is increasingly doubtful.